Hi, everyone. With us now, we have Dr. Zea Malawa. She is a highly respected pediatrician, leader, and public health professional committed to improving the health outcomes for children of color. She's the executive director of Expecting Justice, addressing the racial health disparities that affects Black and Pacific Islander populations in the San Francisco area. Today, Dr. Malawa will be having a conversation centered around cultivating safer birth practices for birthing people. Go ahead, Dr. Malawa.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be with community during Black Maternal Health Week. Do you mind putting up my slides, or can they see them? Beautiful, perfect. So today it's my pleasure to talk to you guys a little bit about addressing racism as a root cause of birth disparities. Next slide. Just for a little bit of context, I want to let you know that I do my work in San Francisco, and I feel like often San Francisco has a really strong reputation of being a very progressive city, which in a lot of regards we are, but that doesn't mean that we don't have the similar kind of racial birth disparities that we see around the country. And so just for some context, I want to share, this is kind of what we're dealing with in the city, where Black women are having preterm birth at twice the rate of white women. Next slide, please. I know that's not unique to us. I know that's the case around the country. So often we are told that Black race is the risk factor for these birth disparities. Can you hit the next? And you can see even the CDC points out that Black race is one of the factors associated with preterm birth. And so I just want to remind everybody that in fact, there's nothing wrong with us, with Black women. The only thing that is wrong is the environment in which we're trying to birth. Dr. Monica McLemore says it best, I think, when she says there is nothing inherent about Black skin that increases risk except for overexposure to racism. And so for that reason, it's important that we figure out how to address racism, because so many of our interventions to improve birth outcomes in the Black community don't address that at all. Next slide. Racism is a huge problem, and I think that a lot of people in the medical and public health field often don't realize what it is that we can do from our position to be addressing a problem as large as racism. And so in 2020, I published a paper that offers a framework of around addressing racism as a root cause to help guide advocates for how they can be more effective in addressing racism as the underlying factor that continues to drive these racial disparities in birth. This framework contains 4 components, and we believe that if you can design an intervention that contains all 4 of these components, then you're probably addressing racism as a root cause of a health disparity, and therefore going to be able to start to narrow that disparity. Next slide, please. The first component is that your intervention has to be long-term. It has to be sustained for decades. Racism is a project in this country that's been around for over 4 centuries, and so you can't think that an intervention that lasts 6 months or maybe even 4 years is going to have a meaningful impact on such a long-standing issue. And so in order for us to be addressing racism at the root cause, we need to be planning for interventions that are going to last for decades or beyond. And what that usually means is policy work and figuring out a way to create an intervention that can be funded in the long term by taxpayer dollars. Next slide, please. The next criteria is that the intervention needs to have a precise impact. And by that we mean that you need to be specific about which racially marginalized group you're trying to support with your intervention. Although all people of color experience racism, they don't experience it the exact same way. For instance, the ways in which racism might be impacting a Vietnamese recently immigrated person is going to be very different than the ways in which racism is impacting an African American person whose family has been here for generations. And so if we want to be addressing racism as a root cause, we need to get really clear and precise about exactly how is racism manifesting so that we are prepared to address those very specific barriers. And of course, I hope it goes without saying that in order to get precise, we need to engage the experts. And community are the experts in how racism is impacting them. And so again, if we want to be precise, not only do we need to get specific about what community, but we need to get specific within the community to understand exactly how racial barriers are manifesting. So we need to pay community experts to inform our interventions. Next slide. The third component is that it needs to focus on systems change. So often our interventions around pregnancy focus on trying to change Black women, making us more resilient, giving us more health education, giving us more options for intervention. But when we're addressing racism as a root cause, we need to instead focus on what the real problem is. And as I mentioned before, we Black women are not the problem. The problem is the environment in which we're expected to birth. And so if we're addressing racism as a root cause, we need our interventions to be focusing on changing policies, on changing systems, on changing environments around birthing people that cause ongoing oppression. Last slide. I'm sorry, next slide. The last criteria that I want to offer to y'all is reparations. And when I say reparations, I of course mean 40 acres and a mule. I of course mean sending checks to people who have experienced grave intergenerational racial harm. But a lot of times we're not in a position in our medical and public health fields to do something like that. And so what I will offer to you as an alternative is to be really thoughtful about how you might be able to shift resources, power, and opportunity into the racially marginalized communities in which you're working. And so I want to give an example of how that usually doesn't happen. So I personally work at the San Francisco Department of Public Health, and our institution, like many institutions in our city, might find out about some new funding opportunity, perhaps a new grant available. And instantly we're going to feel a very strong sense of urgency to reply to that grant opportunity so that we can get the money. And in that sense of urgency, a lot of times we will discount the importance of community voice, and we'll do most of the development of the proposal ourselves without community input. And by doing that, we have now hoarded all of the decision-making power around this new opportunity, this new intervention within the white-led institution, the Department of Public Health in this case. And then, of course, next we're going to probably identify that we need some new staff to help with this new intervention. But because of racism in our HR departments and civil servant laws and other barriers, we're probably going to hire people who are already closely affiliated with the institution and or have racial privilege. And so by doing that, we have also now hoarded all of the new opportunities associated with this intervention within the white-led institution as opposed to trying to share it out with community. And then finally, we're probably going to provide community with, some services that they never really asked for and that are being implemented by people not of their community. And all community is going to get out of this whole intervention probably is these services, whereas the institution is probably going to pay itself indirect fees, administrative fees, high quality fringe benefits, et cetera. And so in making that choice now, we've also hoarded the majority of resources within the institution as opposed to shifting it to community. So when I say we need to address reparations as part of our intervention, what I really want folks to think about is how can we be really thoughtful about creating new opportunities in community when there's a new funding stream? How can we be really thoughtful about sharing authentic decision-making power with the folks that we're trying to support with our interventions? How can we make sure that the majority of the resources, especially the economic resources affiliated with this new intervention, are actually going into the community we're trying to serve? And so next slide, please. When we put all four of these criteria together, we have the racism as a root cause approach. And we feel like if you can include even 3 of these components into your intervention, you're better off than none. 2 is better than none. I also want to mention that the ways that I have now seen this framework be used is that I have seen folks, of course, design a new intervention from scratch, but I've also seen folks kind of use it through a quality improvement perspective, trying to see why their intervention is not producing the anti-racist results they were hoping for, and looking to see, well, is this intervention having a precise impact? Is it actually implementing reparations, et cetera? I've also seen it used as the basis for an RFP, a request for proposals, and for strategic planning. So I invite you to please also take this framework and bring anti-racism to the masses. Next slide. I know I've been speaking kind of in the abstract, and so I want to give you, oh, sorry, this is how you can find the paper if it's useful. Next slide. So I know I've been speaking primarily in the abstract, and so I want to kind of give you an example of what this might look like in practice. Next slide. I want to offer to you the Abundant Birth Project, which is a project that we've been working on for a while in San Francisco. Next slide. The Abundant Birth Project is a cash supplement for Black and Pacific Islander pregnant people. We're providing $1,000 a month, starting as early in pregnancy as we can get to you, and continuing till 6 months postpartum. It's the first of its kind in the United States, and we started enrollment on Juneteenth of 2021, and we have just over 80 moms enrolled so far because it has rolling admissions. And we've also had just over 30 abundant babies born so far, and it's been pretty magical. Next slide, please. In order to be eligible for this program, you need to be under 6 months pregnant and planning to parent. You need to identify as Black and or Pacific Islander. You need to live in San Francisco. Research participation is optional, and you need to have less than $100,000 a year as your family income. We thought it was really important to not just include very, very low income folks in this program, but also middle income folks, because in a city like San Francisco, $100,000 of annual family income is not enough, even, believe it or not, to support all of the needs of a single parent and a single child. And so those folks might still need support in order to reduce financial stress during pregnancy. Next slide. And so we were really intentional about including community in our design process, really trying to share some of that authentic decision-making power with them. And so to start with, we actually hired 4 Black and Pacific Islander people who identify as mothers, and we trained them. We trained them in qualitative interviewing and qualitative data analysis, and we tried to train them in a way that felt like we were in community. So we also ate together, we did art together, and we kind of learned and healed together as part of that training practice. Next slide. And so then our community researchers went out and they conducted nearly 24 in-depth interviews with other Black and Pacific Islander mamas in San Francisco to help us understand what is it that folks in community might want to see from a cash program that is targeting pregnant people. We took the information from those interviews and we actually then did 2 design sprints, again, with different mamas from the community so that we could actually give them the opportunity to tell us, how do we deliver this money? What should we do if somebody has a miscarriage? How should we handle these certain situations? What should we require to have people prove that they're pregnant, etc.? We didn't want to hold such important decisions exclusively within the institution, and so we used these different mechanisms to make sure that community was involved throughout the design process. And we gladly paid for community expertise because we recognize that without their expertise, our project would not be successful. And so in the same way that we would never balk at paying well for instance, a statistician to help us with the project, we also don't balk at paying well for community expertise. Next slide, please. And we have 2 practices that we use throughout our design process and in an ongoing fashion to make sure that we are centering mama's voices throughout. The first is that we use a practice called the expert opinion. Basically, what this is it's an opportunity to be able to make sure that before we take any important votes on our steering committee, which consists of both mamas and a lot of institutional and governmental leaders, that the last thing we hear is the mama's thoughts and voices. And so we take a pause before any vote and we let the mamas kind of tell us what's on their mind, what they think we should do, and what considerations they think we should have. And nobody is allowed to rebut them before we vote. And so that's how we use the expert opinion. We also, sometimes when we take votes, important votes, we might actually weight the votes differently. And so if you identify as a Black or Pacific Islander mama, for instance, we might count your vote double as a way to continue to center the voices of our community when we're doing work with a larger stakeholder group. Next slide, please. Great. And then lastly, about this project, a couple more things about this project I wanted to mention. We worked really hard to create outreach materials that really tried to make sure that mamas felt beautiful and centered. You know, running a cash program runs the risk of kind of creating that same kind of stigma that a lot of mamas feel when they're trying to seek benefits like, you know, welfare or food stamps. In this country, we have demonized poor people and poor parents so completely that it can be a really dehumanizing experience to have to receive those kinds of benefits. We didn't want to fall into that same trap, and so we worked really hard to create outreach materials that really kind of signaled to mamas how we wanted them to feel by participating in this program. Next slide, please. And then just briefly, we're working with our same community researchers to kind of evaluate the outcomes of this program. And so we're not just interested to see if this is going to change birth outcomes. We're also interested to find out how this might impact food security or maternal stress or sense of hope and agency and well-being. And so we're assessing across all of these outcomes. Next slide, please. And then because people are always curious about this, we've also really worked hard to protect the public benefits that many of our recipients receive. And so we were able to get waivers for all housing benefits. They don't have to pay taxes on these benefits. Their Medicaid is protected. Their pregnancy disability is protected. Their CalFresh and CalWorks, which is what we call food stamps and welfare in California, is protected. And the one thing we can't protect, unfortunately, is WIC benefits. And that's just because the state agency is waiting for federal guidance on how to handle guaranteed income programs. Next slide, please. So is this a racism as a root cause intervention, or RRC for short? So is it long-term? We're really, really hoping so. In California, we were able to get a bill called the California Momnibus, or SB 65, passed last year. And part of that bill includes $35 million of funding for pregnancy guaranteed income pilots. Does it have a precise impact? We tend to think so. This program was specifically designed by and offered to Black and Pacific Islander mothers, which are the two groups with the greatest risk of adverse birth outcomes. Systems change, we believe so. This program really tries to provide resources to mamas to make the environment around them a little bit simpler and less stressful, rather than asking mothers to work harder or change in some way. And lastly, reparations, we believe so, because this shifts resources and decision-making power and opportunities to Black and Pacific Islander parents unconditionally. Next slide, please. I want to give you another example of what we believe might be a racism as a root cause intervention, and this is what I already alluded to, which is the California Momnibus Act. Next slide, please. And so SB 65 is a bill that I've been helping to work on in a coalition with a number of other birth justice advocates across California. Part of SB 65 includes funding for diversifying the midwifery workforce. It removes CalWork work requirements for pregnant people. It extends pregnancy Medicaid through 12 months postpartum. It includes benefits of full spectrum doula care as a Medicaid benefit. And lastly, as I mentioned, it includes this funding for pregnancy guaranteed income pilots. We worked with a coalition of doulas from across the state for years to make sure that we were able to get critical input to make sure that we were implementing the bill correctly. And so I'm so excited that the governor signed it into law a few months ago. Next slide, please. So is it a racism as a root cause intervention? Is it long-term? Absolutely. This is the exact type of sustainability policy work that I was suggesting all of us need to work on to create interventions that can last for decades and really have a dramatic impact on racism. Does it have a precise impact? I'm giving that one a little check mark because, of course, law makes it very, very difficult in this country to do racially specific programming with public dollars. But that being said, we tried to structure this bill in such a way that the initiatives will give a disproportionate benefit to folks who have experienced the greatest amount of marginalization historically. Systems change? Absolutely. There's not a single aspect of this bill that's asking mothers to change. What it does instead is really addressing Medicaid policy, TANF policy, increasing diversity in healthcare systems, and other more structural changes that we think are essential when you're trying to address racism. And lastly, reparations, we're giving that a check mark, a yes, because we believe that marginalized people stand the most to gain from the resources, opportunities, and power that will be forthcoming from this bill. Next slide. And so lastly, where I want to end is I want to just talk briefly about how somebody might be able to uproot racism in their own gardens, because I recognize that not all of us are in a position to, advance state legislation over 3 years with large coalitions, but it doesn't mean that we can't all be doing stuff to increase anti-racism for birthing people and other folks of color in our lives and in our communities. Next slide. So long term, when we think through the same framework, it's really important to notice and remember that anti-racism work is a lifelong journey. One-off lectures, occasional workshops, etc. These things are not actually going to have an impact on a system that's been along for as long as racism has been. And so individually, each of us need to make a commitment for our entire lives to learning and unlearning about racism and taking action as we learn to really try and make a difference. Next slide. Precise impact. To that, what I would offer is that it's very important that we center our efforts on the most marginalized. That doesn't mean that if you do other work and your community is not the most marginalized, you shouldn't work there too, but all of us need to collectively come around the folks who need the most support. Next slide. Probably many of you guys have seen this kind of image before at a certain point, and it's just a reminder that we can't kind of treat all groups equally and think that we're going to have equal results. What we have to do is really focus on the groups that have experienced the highest degrees of marginalization and racial oppression and pour all of our energy into those groups if we want to be able to see equal outcomes across the board. Next slide. And then, of course, the third component in the racism as a root cause framework is systems change. If we're trying to do systems change as an individual, that requires us to get political in our free time, because a lot of times it can be difficult to get political on your paycheck time. So I would encourage people to vote every single opportunity that you have, but not only vote, but to support voting rights for other people around the country, especially in certain states where voting has become increasingly difficult for Black people and other people of color. I would encourage you to call your politicians. I'm always surprised by how much clout I have when I call the members of the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco as somebody who is deeply invested in public health. I feel like they don't hear very often from health advocates, and so they take us very seriously when we make the time to come and testify in front of them. And of course, partner with other groups that are focused on systems change, because none of this work can happen alone, but it doesn't mean that you have to carry it all by yourself. We can always do it in community, which makes it more fun and more effective. Next slide. And then lastly, around reparations. How do we do reparations as individuals? So first, let's share our power. How do you take the power that you have at work and beyond to invite community members to participate when there are critical decisions being made? How do we get, community members' perspectives elevated when there is discussion around what needs to happen in their communities? How do you share your opportunities? Mentoring and sponsoring Black and Indigenous students is really critical. I myself can say that I got no mentorship throughout medical school. And I can't help but wonder how different my career or other Black students' careers would be if we had just had the same kind of mentorship that many other students were getting. And so we have to go out of our way to make sure that folks who experience racial marginalization are getting high quality mentorship and sponsorship. And all of us can do something in that regard. And then lastly, share your resources if you have them. Donate money, donate time to Black-led and Indigenous-led organizations. Pay Black and Indigenous people for their work, for their expertise, and for their emotional labor when it comes into contact with your work. Next slide. So anyways, I just want to thank you all so much for your kind attention, and I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any. I also recognize it's right before your lunch.
Thank you, Dr. Malawa. Amazing presentation. We do have a couple of questions from audience members. One question is this backed by grant support, and how can we implement this in other states?
Okay, so yes, we had to start initially with private fundraising to pay for the Abundant Birth Project. And now we're doing that careful work, as I already alluded to start to weave in public funding to help hopefully keep it going past the initial 150 moms that we had budgeted for. As far as bringing it to other states, I'm like here for it. So we worked with the San Francisco Treasurer's Office to get all of those benefits protections, and that was like a really politically complicated effort. So we wrote a report about it to help anybody else do it, and all of the letters that we had to submit to state agencies, we published it. So if you Google something like San Francisco Treasurer's Office and protecting benefits, you'll be able to find that report pretty readily. And I can also email it to the organizers to share it out. So that's one thing that you can do. And then we're hoping by Labor Day. That's what feels like an important day for mothers to us. So we're hoping by Labor Day on the Expecting Justice website, which is Expecting Justice is my organization that hosts the Abundant Birth Project. We're hoping to have a report that will kind of, or a toolkit even, that will kind of lay out step by step how you can engage your community to create a similar Abundant Birth Project locally. So yeah, please copy us shamelessly. We want all of the Black birthing people to have the resources they need for healthy pregnancies.
Mhm. Have you thought about expanding or modeling outside of the area that you're currently doing this in?
Yeah, so part of our sustainability plan was the Momnibus bill and getting some of that state funding so that we can scale it. And so the next step that we're hoping to move towards actually is we're hoping to scale across California in the coming years so that we can test this intervention out on a much larger group of people and hopefully become an evidence-based solution so that then folks can maybe use some of the government funding that we spend on perinatal outcomes on this evidence-based solution as opposed to some of the others that we spend a lot of dollars on, despite the fact that they don't seem to be closing disparities at all. So we're hoping to scale across California. And then we're also just hoping to set ourselves up in such a way that folks, no matter where they are in the country, could hopefully use even public dollars to be able to implement. So stand by or call us if you want to help.
How do you stay so positive and upbeat doing this work long term? Your energy is infectious.
Okay, let's be clear. It's Friday. No, I'm kidding. I think that one of the things is that I feel remarkably hopeful in the last 5 years. Like I'm a woman in my mid 40s, and I can say that in my lifetime, up until the last few years, I have never seen the level of racial justice organizing that I have seen in the last few years. I mean, just even the fact that we have a Black Maternal Health Week in this country and that it gets recognized in a meaningful way, like all across the country, is something that I don't know that I have ever seen the likes of. And so, I continue to see really hard outcomes. But I also now am seeing, for instance, funders putting millions of dollars behind way outside the box ideas like giving Black pregnant people unrestricted cash. And so it's hard not to feel a little bit energized and excited when opportunities like that are opening up. So that's how I get excited.
And one additional question from our audience member. How did you come up with the $100,000 limit and what was the basis for that? And what was
Okay,
the
so it was a couple of things. So the main thing, honestly, was community feedback. Early on, when we first even started to kind of throw this idea out in different community gatherings, we heard really strongly from Black moms in San Francisco who are kind of trapped in that donut hole where they make too much money to qualify for benefits, but not enough to get ahead. And, San Francisco, if you don't know, similar to Boston, is an extraordinarily expensive city. And so, so many of our benefits are based on the federal poverty limits. And that like means nothing in cities like ours. And so
right?
we knew that we needed to reach not just the very, very low income, but also, middle income and people who are working, but still feeling financial stress with
Right.
our supplement. There is an organization called the Insight Center for Community Development. And on their website, they have something called the Family Needs Calculator. And basically you can put in a zip code and the number of people in the family, and they can kind of tell you, I know it at least works in California, they can tell you how much do you need to make the ends meet in that city. And so using that, we kind of backed into some numbers that we thought were going to be around the right amount. And then we turned the decision making over to community. And that's kind of where we got.
Okay. Awesome. And this is a final question. If you can give one piece of advice to anyone embarking on work like this, what would it be?
Ooh, it's two pieces of advice, right? I think the first is that you really have to get your emotional resourcing together because there are so many disappointments, like way more disappointments than victories. And it's easy for me to give you this slideshow making it seem so pretty, but you guys can't see all like the grant rejections and like hard conversations. So you got to have like your emotional stuff together. And then you also need to have somebody who's going to hold you accountable. I think all of us have been coming up in these systems that engage in white saviorism and white supremacy without even realizing it. I mean, even in progressive cities like ours, it's just the norm, it's just the default. And so you need to have people in your life, ideally community too, to just keep you accountable to making sure that you're not accidentally defaulting into this very seductive kind of easier road. So those would be my two pieces of advice.
All right. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation, Dr. Malawa. That was great.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I hope everybody enjoys their weekend and everybody does something that is really important and anti-racist for Black Maternal Health Week next week.
Thank you. Following this session, we have a 20-minute lunch break. During this time, we will have a regular session open for those who would like to converse with other attendees during this lunch. So please come and join us. Following this break will be Dr. Larkin's Pettigrew's presentation. This session can be found in the lobby under the Agenda tab. Don't forget about our gamification activities. It's your chance to win one of $500 gift cards from Kindred Bravely and or a large Black Maternal Health Conference branded t-shirt. Attendees can earn points by attending main stage, regular, and networking sessions, as well as the Expo Lounge. In the Expo Lounge, you can earn points by visiting our sponsors' booth, watching videos, downloading files, and clicking links. Lastly, earn points in the networking session by sending or receiving a connection, as well as getting matched. Details about each challenge and points can be found on the Gamification Challenges tab in the lobby. Enjoy your lunches.